The sky over the Pacific was quiet that morning, too quiet for a war that had devoured half the world. A blanket of grey clouds hung low over the ocean, and below them, somewhere in that endless blue, a single American bomber skimmed the waves, flying at a height so dangerously low it could almost touch the sea. Inside that cockpit sat a man whose name few people remember today, yet for 3 days in 1944, his daring changed the course of the Pacific War. His name was Lieutenant Jack Daredevil Fellows, and his story is one of impossible odds, military defiance, and a bombing run so reckless it was officially forbidden by US command. But when orders failed, when strategy crumbled, and when the enemy ruled the skies, Fellows decided to do what no one else dared. Fly just 200 feet above the water, right into the heart of the Japanese fleet. Before those 3 days were over, 12 enemy ships would be burning, the sea choked with smoke and oil, and a quiet American pilot would etch his name into history. Not for following rules, but for breaking them. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to a time when the Pacific Ocean was a graveyard of steel and fire. It was mid-1944. The Japanese Navy was still strong, its convoys protected by anti-aircraft guns, fast destroyers, and deadly Zero fighters. For Allied pilots, attacking those ships meant suicide. Dive bombers were easy targets. Torpedo planes rarely came back, and high-altitude bombing, though safer, was almost useless. The bombs missed their targets, lost to wind and waves. The enemy ships just zigzagged, laughed, and kept sailing. But Jack Fellows wasn't the kind of man who accepted failure. Born in a small town in Montana, he grew up fixing farm tractors, flying crop dusters, and chasing storms for fun. By the time he joined the US Army Air Forces, he already had one thing most pilots didn't: complete control at dangerously low altitudes. To him, flying close to the ground wasn't madness. It was precision. When he was assigned to the 5th Air Force in the South Pacific, Fellows quickly gained a reputation. He didn't talk much, didn't smile much, and didn't boast. But when he flew, other men stopped to watch. They called him Daredevil. Not because he showed off, but because he never seemed to flinch. He treated his bomber like an extension of himself, fast, precise, and fearless. In early August 1944, the Allies faced a nightmare. Japanese convoys were slipping through the Bismarck Sea, bringing reinforcements and supplies to New Guinea. The sea lanes were guarded by destroyers and cruisers armed with anti-aircraft cannons that tore through anything that approached. Several U.S. bombing missions had already failed. Dozens of planes had been lost. Morale was low, and command was desperate. That's when Fellows came forward with an idea that sounded insane. "If we can't hit them from above," he said, "we'll hit them from below." His plan was to use a B-25 Mitchell bomber, a medium-range plane, modified for low-level strafing and skip bombing. Instead of dropping bombs from 5,000 feet, he'd drop them at 200 feet, skipping them across the water like flat stones until they hit a ship's hull. It was a tactic rarely used, and officially discouraged, because flying that low meant suicide. One wrong move, one burst of flak, one gust of wind, and the plane would be shredded or plunge into the sea. His commanding officer told him no. The official order was clear: no bombing runs below 1,000 feet. But Fellows wasn't a man who waited for permission when lives were on the line. The next morning, without authorization, he took off with his crew, 4 men who trusted him enough to follow him anywhere. As the engines roared and the Pacific wind tore against the cockpit, Fellows leveled the plane lower and lower until the altimeter barely moved. The ocean blurred beneath him, just a few heartbeats away. The crew held their breath. The Japanese fleet was ahead, 12 ships in tight formation, their anti-aircraft guns ready. No one in command knew what was about to happen. That first run would change everything. The B-25's engines screamed as Fellows came in low, waves splashing up against the fuselage. The gunners on the Japanese destroyer didn't even react at first. They'd never seen a bomber flying that close to the water. By the time they opened fire, it was too late. Fellows dropped two 500-pound bombs so low they almost touched the waves. Both skipped once, twice, and then slammed into the side of the destroyer. The explosion lifted the ship out of the water. The crew inside the B-25 shouted, the plane rocked, and Fellows pulled up just in time to avoid the fireball. 1 ship down, 11 more to go. When he landed back at base, command was furious. But word spread fast. Other pilots wanted to know how he'd done it. Fellows didn't brag. He just said, keep it low. Don't think, just fly. Over the next 2 days, he'd go back again and again. Through smoke, flak, and burning oil, hitting ships so close that metal fragments scraped the paint off his bomber's belly. Some runs were made in near darkness, others through rain. Each time the same result: chaos for the Japanese fleet, disbelief among his peers, and silence from the brass who couldn't officially admit he was right. But by the end of that 3rd day, 12 ships were gone. Not damaged. Gone. Sunk beneath the waves of the Bismarck Sea. No one in the history of the Pacific War had pulled off something like that. And few ever would again. The mission became known only in whispers, written in faded reports buried in military archives. But among pilots, it became legend. The story of the man who flew below radar, ignored every order, and rewrote what was possible in aerial warfare. And yet, for all the glory, there was something about Jack Fellows that remained heavy. Because every time he returned, he saw fewer planes taking off beside him. The Pacific didn't forgive courage, and neither did command. In the days that followed, the military tried to keep his missions quiet. Officially, there had been no forbidden bombing run. No pilot had defied orders. But the ships at the bottom of the sea told a different story. The truth, the real truth, would only come out years later. And when it did, historians realized that what Jack Fellows had done in those 3 days not only saved Allied lives, but forced the Navy to rethink air tactics entirely. But what exactly happened during those 72 hours? How did one man and his small crew sink 12 ships, using a method nobody believed in? And what price did he pay for breaking the rules? The answers to those questions lie in the mission logs, the photographs, and the last radio transmissions from the Pacific, where the line between bravery and madness was razor thin. In the next part, we'll go deep into those 3 days, hour by hour, and uncover how Jack Fellows' forbidden run became one of the most daring operations of World War II. The first day of the mission began before dawn. A thin mist covered the sea, and the horizon looked like a faded watercolor. All greys and soft blues. From the airfield in New Guinea, the sound of engines filled the humid morning. Mechanics shouted over the roar, final checks were made, and the air carried that mix of oil, metal, and fear that only wartime could create. Jack Fellows stood beside his B-25, eyes fixed on the ocean ahead. He didn't say much. He never did. But the crew could tell something was different that morning. They weren't following orders anymore. They were following him. The official target was a Japanese convoy carrying troops and supplies to reinforce positions around WWII. Intelligence said it was escorted by destroyers and patrol boats, small, fast, and deadly accurate with their anti-aircraft guns. Every pilot knew what that meant. A standard high-altitude bombing run was a death sentence. The enemy gunners would pick them off like flies. But Fellows had another plan. As his crew loaded the modified bombs, each one fused for low-level release, he quietly went over the routine again and again. They'd fly at 200 feet, just above the wave tops, staying beneath enemy radar. They'd drop fast, hit hard, and pull away low. If they survived the first run, they'd circle back for a second strike. The crew didn't argue. They'd seen him fly. And once you saw Jack Fellows in the cockpit, fear had a way of taking a back seat. The The B-25 rolled down the strip and lifted into the pale sky. Behind him, 2 other bombers followed, men who had decided that if they were going to die, they'd rather die doing something that mattered. For nearly 2 hours, the formation flew low and silent over the sea. Then, as they crossed into enemy waters, the radio cracked with static. The convoy had been spotted. A line of ships cutting through the calm blue water, smoke curling from their funnels. "Target in sight," Fellows said softly. His hand tightened on the yoke. "We go low." The other pilots followed. The altimeters dropped 500 feet, 400, 300, 250. The ocean now looked like a living thing, shimmering beneath them, close enough to taste the salt spray. Fellows aimed for the lead destroyer. The Japanese sailors spotted them. The alarm went up, sirens wailed, and black smoke poured from gun barrels. Tracers cut through the sky. Fellows held steady. The sea erupted with flak bursts around him, but he didn't climb. "Hold her steady," he muttered. "Just a little closer." At 200 feet, he released the bombs. They skipped once across the water. Once, twice. Then slammed into the destroyer's hull, just below the deck line. The explosion tore through the ship like thunder. Metal screamed, the bridge collapsed, and the ship began to roll. Direct hit. The co-pilot yelled. But there was no time to celebrate. Fellows banked hard, pulling the bomber away as bullets ripped through the tail. One gunner was hit. A clean shot through the shoulder. But he kept firing, sweeping the deck of another ship below. By the time they returned to base, the first destroyer was gone. The Japanese convoy had scattered, trying to escape in every direction. Command didn't believe the report at first. They thought it was luck, a fluke hit. But Fellows knew better. That night, while the rest of the airfield slept, he pored over the mission footage. The skip bombing had worked exactly as he imagined. The low altitude gave the bombs precision and speed, too fast for the ships to react. The next morning, he went out again. This time with 4 planes. The second day was chaos. Clouds rolled in, turning the sky into a dull grey mirror. The sea below was rough, and visibility was poor. But Fellows insisted they go. "If we can't see them," he said, "they can't see us." The plan was to strike the convoy again, now regrouped and protected by a cruiser. But as they neared the target zone, the wind shifted, revealing the faint shapes of enemy ships through the mist. The cruiser was massive, its deck lined with guns, its wake carving deep scars into the water. Fellows went first. His voice came through the radio, calm as always. "Stay tight. We'll take her head on." The B-25s dropped lower, 250 feet, 200. The turbulence was brutal, waves splashing against the fuselage. The Japanese guns opened fire, spraying the air with steel. One plane was hit, smoke trailing behind it. But Fellows didn't flinch. He dropped his first set of bombs. Both skipped across the choppy water and hit the cruiser dead center. The explosion was so powerful that shockwaves rippled across the sea. The cruiser began to list, its deck breaking apart. Then, something strange happened. The Japanese gunners, panicking, started firing wildly into the water, thinking more planes were coming in. Fellows used the confusion to make another pass. On that second run, he hit a transport ship carrying ammunition. The blast lit up the horizon like sunrise. By sunset, 4 ships were burning. The others fled north, leaving trails of smoke that could be seen for miles. When Fellows landed again, even his commanding officer couldn't hide his disbelief. "You're going to get yourself caught, Marshalled," the officer said. "But damn it, you're saving the fleet." For the third and final day, Fellows planned one last run. This time, he'd take only his crew. The Japanese survivors had regrouped near a small island, forming a tight defensive circle. It was a trap. Bait for anyone reckless enough to approach. And that's exactly what Fellows did. He flew in at dawn, using the sun as cover. The light blinded the enemy gunners as the B-25 came in low, waves breaking against the nose. Every gun on every ship opened fire. The air was a storm of metal. At that moment, Fellows did something no one expected. He cut the throttle, dropping even lower, letting the bomber almost glide across the water. The Japanese guns overshot him completely. When he was within 500 yards, he fired everything: nose guns, side guns, and then the final set of bombs. 3 direct hits, 3 ships gone. The rest, crippled, burning or sinking fast. Radio operators on nearby islands heard the explosions. Smoke rose so high it was visible from 30 miles away. 12 ships destroyed in 3 days. When Fellows returned to base for the last time, his plane was barely holding together. Holes in the wings, glass shattered, paint scorched by heat. The crew climbed out in silence, exhausted, alive, and forever changed. There were no medals waiting for them, no headlines, just quiet nods from the men who had once called him crazy. But in the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Word spread across the Pacific. Other bomber units began experimenting with low-level skip bombing. Tactics were rewritten. Training manuals were updated. What had once been forbidden was now doctrine. Jack Fellows had rewritten the rulebook, not in an office, but in the open sky, with the sea rising beneath his wings. Still, the price of that victory would come due soon enough. Because when you break the rules of war, even for the right reasons, the system never forgives you easily. And that's where the story turns, from triumph to consequence. In the final part, we'll uncover what happened after those legendary missions, how Command reacted, what became of Jack Fellows, and why his name almost disappeared from history. When the smoke cleared over the Bismarck Sea, the wrecks of 12 Japanese vessels drifted slowly beneath the waves. The air was still thick with oil and ash. Seagulls circled above the water, screaming over the silence that followed 3 days of fire. And somewhere on a muddy airstrip in New Guinea, Lieutenant Jack Fellows sat on the wing of his battered B-25, his flight jacket dark with sweat and salt, staring into the distance as mechanics patched holes in the fuselage. He had done the impossible. He had turned a handful of bombers into a fleet destroyer. But in the military, heroism and insubordination often looked the same. 2 days later, Fellows was called into the command tent. His commanding officer stood stiff behind a wooden desk, holding a thin report. "Lieutenant," he said, "you've broken direct orders 3 times. You've endangered your crew. You've flown outside regulation altitudes, and you've used unauthorized tactics." Fellows said nothing. He knew what was coming, but the officer continued after a pause. "You also sank 12 enemy ships, and every man in this base knows it." He looked up, and for the first time, his tone softened. "The brass wants to keep this quiet. They can't have every pilot out there trying what you did. So officially, this never happened." Fellows nodded once. That was his commendation. Silence. No medal, no ceremony. Just a firm handshake and a classified report that would disappear into a file cabinet for decades. His crew received similar treatment. They were reassigned to different units, scattered across the Pacific, told never to speak about the details of their missions. Some didn't survive the months that followed. Others returned home years later, never quite the same. But among the pilots, word spread like wildfire. Stories of the man who flew lower than anyone else, who faced the seahead on and lived to tell about it. Over time, his tactics began showing up quietly in field manuals. New sections on low-level attack strategies, skip bombing techniques and radar evasion. None of them mentioned his name, but the fingerprints were there. By early 1945, the technique that Fellows had pioneered unofficially became standard practice across several Pacific squadrons. Bombers that once struggled to hit moving ships were suddenly striking with terrifying precision. Japanese convoys began sailing at night, terrified of what might be waiting just above the waves. Historians later calculated that the success rate of low-level skip bombing increased Allied strike accuracy by more than 400%. That meant fewer missions, fewer losses, and thousands of lives saved. But for Jack Fellows, glory never came. After the war, he returned to Montana, back to the same open skies where he'd first learned to fly. He worked on small planes, crop, dusted in the summers, and rarely spoke of what he'd done. When people asked about the war, he'd smile faintly and say, "I did a little flying." Decades passed. The world moved on. The Pacific grew quiet again, and his story, like so many others, was nearly lost to time. Until one day, in the early 1970s, a young historian named Mark Hollister was digging through declassified mission reports in Washington. He came across a single, almost forgotten entry, unverified low-level strike, Bismarck Sea, August 1944. Possible 12 confirmed sinkings. No squadron number, no pilot listed. Just that phrase, forbidden altitude. Hollister was intrigued. He spent months tracking down veterans, piecing together fragments of radio transcripts, flight logs, and personal letters. Eventually, he found what he was looking for. A name that appeared again and again, scribbled in the margins of other pilots' journals, Fellows. By the time Hollister located him, Jack Fellows was living quietly outside Great Falls, fixing planes for a living. When asked about the mission, he hesitated for a long time before saying just 6 words. "We did what had to be done." He didn't want fame. He didn't want recognition. But when the historian pressed him to share the details, Fellows finally agreed. Not for himself, but for his crew. For the men who never made it home. Through his words, and through the dusty files of forgotten archives, the full story of those 3 days finally came to light. And when it did, military historians were stunned. They realized that Fellows' unauthorized runs had forced an evolution in aerial warfare. One that influenced not just the Pacific campaign, but future air strategies for decades to come. It wasn't just bravery that defined him, it was precision, control, and a willingness to risk everything when the official playbook failed. Even so, the US military never formally recognized his missions. Some say it was politics, others say it was pride. But the truth is simpler. Jack Fellows' story didn't fit into the clean lines of official history. It was too wild, too human, too real. He died quietly in 1987, with no medals on his wall, no documentaries in his name, and no public ceremony. But years later, when the historian who uncovered his story spoke at a veterans event, he ended with a line that captured it best. "Some heroes are made by orders. Others are made when orders are broken." And perhaps that's what makes the story of Jack Fellows so haunting. Because in the end, his victory wasn't just against the enemy, it was against fear itself, against hesitation, against the rules that said this can't be done. 12 ships in 3 days, a 200-foot run that defied everything taught in flight school, and a legacy written not in medals or headlines, but in the quiet courage of one man who chose to fly closer to death, to bring others home alive. Even today, military aviators still talk about the low run, a phrase whispered with a kind of respect that transcends time. It's the moment when instinct takes over, when you fly not by instruments but by heart. And somewhere, maybe in that wide Montana sky, you can almost imagine a lone shadow streaking just above the fields. Steady, fearless, and impossibly low, Jack Fellows, the man who broke the rules and changed the war.